and then come right back.
Hope so.
Possiamo partire. Bene, buongiorno.
Paolo, non aspettiamo che si colleghino altre persone?
Dai, cominciamo.
Siete online.
Siamo online, siamo in YouTube.
Vabbè,
Tanto la gran parte delle persone seguirà su YouTube. Bene, volevo semplicemente introdurre questo ultimo incontro di questa stagione di Discutendo di Storia. Ieri abbiamo concluso gli incontri del libro del giovedì, oggi concludiamo Discutendo di Storia, tutte iniziative che ripartiranno nella nuova stagione a settembre, in autunno. Questa serie di incontri organizzati con il Dipartimento di Studi Storici si chiude oggi con l'intervento con la presentazione appunto del libro di Markus Rediker, il piantagrane, Storia di Benjamin Lay. Lo discuteranno appunto Pietro Adamo ed Eleonora Belligni, che insegnano appunto storia moderna nel nostro dipartimento. Markus Rediker è professore emerito dell'Università di Pittsburgh, dove ha insegnato storia, e io lascerei a voi appunto la guida di questo incontro e darei la parola, immagino, a chi insomma di voi due la vuole assumere, a Pietro o a Eleonora, vedete voi come organizzare.
Allora, Markus dice che Zoom non gli permette di condividere lo schermo.
Yeah, it's still saying.
Adesso no, è uscito adesso adesso è ok.
È uscito.
È ok. Adesso è ok.
Try again.
Try again now, because
Try again.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing what I need to see. Hold on. Hold on. Yes.
Ok. Ok.
Ciao Nino, come stai? Scusami se ti disturbo, io sono un po' nelle curve perché ero fuori in casa e sono rientrata oggi e devo inviare.
Chi sta parlando? Guardate chi sta parlando, guardate che la persona che sta parlando si sente.
Pietro, should I turn it off and then turn it on when we start?
Ok.
Turn it off now?
Okay, yes, turn it off.
Okay.
Ok. Va bene, allora parto io. Mi sono già scusato con Markus perché ho intenzione di fare una presentazione in italiano. Gli ho raccontato in inglese che cosa più o meno avrei detto, in modo tale che lui abbia un'idea pallida di ciò che adesso vi vado a raccontare. Comincerò con il ringraziare ovviamente Markus Rediker per essere qui con noi oggi, per aver accettato il nostro invito. Ringrazio anche ovviamente Eleonora Belligni, ma il ringraziamento di Eleonora è più scontato perché Eleonora per me è quasi una compagna di strada. Mi meraviglio di più quando non c'è che non quando c'è. Quindi permettetemi appunto di cominciare in questo modo. E permettetemi di cominciare dicendo che per me è uno straordinario piacere avere qui oggi Markus Rediker, ma questo però non lo dico come in genere si dicono queste cose in occasioni come queste, cioè non è una platitude, non è una banalità, per me è veramente un momento quasi emozionante, perché nonostante oggi sia la prima volta che io veda di persona Markus Rediker faccia a faccia, vis-à-vis, lo conosco da tantissimi anni, lo conosco da più di 30 anni, da quasi 35 anni, e sono 35 anni che seguo quello che lui scrive, seguo le sue ricerche, quindi oggi per me è quasi come avere a che fare con un amico, una persona che conosco anche se non ho mai visto prima, che non ho mai conosciuto direttamente. Quindi ripeto, non è il fatto che sia un piacere particolare, non è una delle banalità da presentazione, ma invece qualcosa di vero. Ripeto, sono quasi un po' emozionato al pensiero appunto di poter interagire con lui in questo modo, e sono anche in grado di provare il fatto che ho seguito per tutti questi anni ciò che Markus ha scritto. Io l'ho incontrato per la prima volta da studente. Scusate, sentite questo fischio? Lo sentite? Credo di essere io. Dicevo che l'ho incontrato per la prima volta da studente quando studiavo in Inghilterra, la rivoluzione inglese, i British Marxist Historians, e comprai questo libro. Io non vi condivido le copertine, eccetera. Vi faccio vedere direttamente i libri, che mi sembra una cosa anche più simpatica. Questo libro uscì, mi sembra, nel 1988. Sì, nel 1988. Io lo comprai quando ero ancora uno studente, non ero ancora laureato, e comprai questo libro perché studiavo Hill, Thompson, British Marxist Historians, la rivoluzione inglese, e incontrai per la prima volta appunto un saggio di Markus che mi colpì immediatamente, perché mi sembrò che stesse quasi per risolvere quel gran problema storiografico che gli storici marxisti inglesi si erano posti da tanto tempo, e cioè trovare le linee di continuità del radicalismo britannico tra la rivoluzione inglese e la rivoluzione americana, e mi sembrò un tentativo veramente molto molto convincente. Però non è questo la prova maggiore che posso darvi del fatto che io sia un lettore appassionato, a fan reader of Markus Rediker, che sia un suo lettore attento. Posso raccontarvi un altro episodio che credo che sia ancora più divertente, che si tratta di una quasi truffa letteraria. Quando adesso si studia da casa, una volta se uno voleva leggere i testi 5-600eschi doveva andare nelle biblioteche, là dove questi testi erano contenuti, e io in effetti per lungo tratto della mia vita ho frequentato Londra, Oxford, la British Library, la Bodleian Library, eccetera, e nel 1992-93 comprai questo libro. Lo trovai a Londra nel 92-93 e lo lessi con grande passione. Dopodiché, tornato a Milano, siccome uno dei miei referenti accademici ed editoriali aveva una grande passione per i pirati, gli feci vedere il libro e gli dissi: perché non traduciamo in inglese questo libro? È un libro che parla della cultura politica dei pirati. E la persona in questione lo prese, lo lesse, siccome non era scemo mi disse: Pietro, ma solo l'ultimo capitolo parla di pirati, così, però ne pare, c'è un capitolo che vale la pena. E allora traducemmo in inglese, io tradussi insieme all'amico Marco Pasi questo libro in italiano, intitolandolo Sulle tracce dei pirati. È un libro sulla cultura politica marinara nel Settecento, nell'ambito della cultura atlantica settecentesca, però c'era un capitolo che si prestava molto bene alla questione dei pirati, quindi noi lo proponemmo all'editore come divertente libro sui pirati. E il momento clou della nostra interazione con l'editore, che era PM, fu quando l'editore ci chiese se era possibile togliere tutte le note dal libro, cioè pubblicare il libro senza note, e noi ridemmo come dei pazzi al pensiero di un libro come questo, che è un libro altamente erudito, e che potesse essere pubblicato appunto senza le note. Devo dire che qualche anno dopo una delle case editrici di Rediker, Elèuthera in italiano, fece la stessa cosa, pubblicando il suo Billions of All Nations, mettendo le note in rete, cioè pubblicando il libro senza note, ma mettendo le note in rete. Io feci un casino tale, non so dire adesso se fui efficace con i direttori della casa editrice, ma piantai giù un casino tale da costringerli all'edizione successiva a rimettere le note all'interno del libro. Se andate a comprarlo adesso in libreria troverete anche le note. Dunque, allora passiamo al tema di oggi, non tanto il libro, ma tanto piuttosto l'opera di Rediker, l'opera storica di Rediker, che in Italia è conosciuto, ma non credo abbastanza valutato. Scusate un momento. Solo acqua. Non credo abbastanza valutato nell'ambito della sua opera. Mi sembra che come dire, Markus non sia considerato abbastanza per quanto abbia fatto e per quanto ha saputo proporre negli ultimi 35 anni. No? Quindi io adesso mi limito qui a proporvi 2 o 3 punti di riflessione, di spunto sulla sua opera, e poi magari ne parliamo dopo aver discusso del suo ultimo libro. Allora, il primo punto che è sicuramente da sottolineare è che Markus si situa in una tradizione storiografica abbastanza precisa, in Italia non diciamo così nota dal punto di vista storiografico eccetera, ma praticata in modi diversi da come viene praticata negli Stati Uniti, cioè la cosiddetta history from below. Non dobbiamo fare degli sforzi eccessivi per capire come la sua opera si situa all'interno, come dire, per situare la sua opera all'interno di questa tradizione, perché lui stesso molte volte ha riconosciuto questa appartenenza, si è sistemato, per così dire, all'interno di questa tradizione. In una sua antologia uscita qualche anno fa, mi sembra del 2014, c'è una dedica interessante, una dedica a 3 dei grandi storici che negli anni 60 riscoprirono una storia fatta dal basso dei ceti subalterni, della loro attività, della loro incidenza sulla politica americana. La dedica era a Stoughton Lynd, grande storico quacchero, anche personaggio principale della nuova sinistra, a Jesse Lemisch e a Gary Nash, che sono 3 degli storici che in quel periodo cominciarono a studiare il ruolo dei ceti subalterni nel farsi della cultura politica americana. Non solo questo, ma Markus dedica il libro anche ad un personaggio poco noto in Italia, ma che varrebbe davvero la pena di rivalutare, che si chiama Alfred Young, che è un grande, uno dei primi storici accademici americani a dedicarsi al radicalismo. Non dimentichiamoci che si esce fuori dagli anni 50, l'età del consenso, l'età della guerra fredda, no? L'età della difesa a oltranza dei valori della civiltà liberale, e si entra negli anni 60 dove tanti di quei valori centrali e primari vengono messi in discussione. Nel 1968 Young pubblica un libro che credo abbia avuto una certa importanza per Markus, poi magari glielo chiediamo in inglese, un libro bellissimo che si intitola Dissent, An Exploration in the History of American Radicalism, ed è un libro che nel 68 fece un enorme, sollevò un enorme interesse, proprio perché metteva dentro tutti questi autori che cominciavano a fare la storia del radicalismo tenendo conto dell'esperienza degli anni 60, della contestazione, del movimento per i diritti civili, degli SDS, degli studenti, eccetera, eccetera. Pensate che era un libro che finiva con 3 capitoli, in verità 4, ma su 3 argomenti fondamentali nella storia del radicalismo americano, cioè che leggeva la storia del radicalismo americano alla luce di questi ultimi 3 punti, che erano il Black Power, che erano il movimento femminista e che erano gli SDS, gli studenti. Cioè, quindi come dire, la capacità di mettere in luce come esistesse nella storia americana un filo rosso che conduceva alle esperienze radicali di quel particolare momento. Io devo dire, ho studiato un pensatore anarchico che si chiama Paul Goodman, che era diciamo così, che condivideva da vicino questo modo di porre il problema della storia del radicalismo negli Stati Uniti. La quinta persona a cui Rediker dedica il libro è Edward Thompson. Edward Thompson, il grande storico marxista inglese. Uno dei suoi libri successivi, mi sembra proprio quel Villains of All Nations che ho citato prima, è dedicato a Christopher e Bridget Hill. Quindi non solo storia dal basso all'americana, ma anche l'esperienza degli storici marxisti inglesi, nella consapevolezza che la storiografia di Markus è una storiografia atlantica, cioè è una storiografia che legge in stretta connessione la storia britannica e la storia americana, la storia della madrepatria e la storia delle colonie, prima e dopo che si facciano Stato federale. E la proposta storiografica di Markus, secondo me, è di enorme forza. Cioè Markus ci propone di fatto di leggere l'evoluzione della cultura politica dei ceti subalterni nel corso del Settecento alla luce della autoproduzione di pratiche sociali, dell'autoproduzione di sapere politico da parte di quei ceti subalterni che sono impegnati, diciamo così, nella tratta atlantica, ovvero i marinai, i pirati, ma non solo, i servi a contratto, le donne, i meticci, i neri, gli indiani, cioè tutto un insieme di ceti subalterni, diciamo così. Uno degli storici che Marx non cita, forse non gli è simpatico, cioè Howard Zinn, scrisse in quegli stessi anni un libro in cui rifaceva la storia dell'America dal punto di vista di questi ceti subalterni, A People's History of the United States. Quindi la sua proposta è questa, ma attenzione, cioè è questa nel senso dello studio delle pratiche che questi gruppi autoproducono, non che di questi gruppi maturano a confronto con altro, ma che piuttosto all'interno della loro specifica esperienza sociale essi producono una serie di saperi, una serie di politiche, una serie di culture che sono profondamente autonomi, vengono fuori dal basso e si articolano verso l'alto. È come se Markus avesse scritto, per citare l'autore che tutti noi conosciamo, cioè Edward Thompson, una moral economy del radicalismo dei ceti subalterni nella tratta atlantica. Voglio leggervi un passo che Markus ha scritto, che non è su se stesso, ma è su Selma James, che è la moglie del grande storico CLR James, che noi in Italia conosciamo perché Feltrinelli tradusse quasi da subito il suo famoso libro The Black Jacobins, i giacobini neri per Feltrinelli, cioè anche egli un grande storico della tratta atlantica, ed è poi una vicenda particolare, no? Buttato fuori dagli Stati Uniti, andò a vivere in Inghilterra, poi Selma è stata, ella stessa è stata un personaggio di grande storica e di grande attivista nel movimento femminista, nel movimento no global, e credo, Markus, Selma Jones is still alive?
Yes.
She's still alive. She says she's 90 or something like that.
Yes.
Cioè, è ancora viva. Ecco, su Selma Markus scrive la seguente cosa, che io vi traduco in italiano, non ve la leggo in inglese, ve la traduco, ed è evidente come, secondo me, in quello che lui scrive di Selma si ritrova la sua propria storiografia. Scusatemi, per fare questo ho bisogno di glasses, I can't read. La teoria politica di James e le sue strategie organizzative quindi venivano dal basso. Questo vuol dire non da intellettuali o da funzionari di partito che dicono alla gente che lavora che cosa devono fare, ma piuttosto da factory workers, da operai, casalinghe, prostitute e migranti, come le seguenti pagine dimostreranno. E queste persone non venivano solo da Londra o da New York, ma da posti che vanno dal Messico al Venezuela, da Haiti al Kenya alla Tanzania. James insiste non solo nel far derivare le sue idee dall'interazione con il working people of all kinds and all nations, e ella coerentemente mette alla prova e raffina e li raffina nello stesso ambiente. Dal suo primo pamphlet, che ella discusse con i suoi compagni operai e vicini, lei si è sempre affidata non solo alla decency del common people, ma anche alla loro abilità di pensare e di agire. E questo mi sembra essere il punto centrale dell'opera di Rediker, cioè la ricostruzione di queste nicchie ecologiche e sociali, per così dire, i pirati, i marinai, i meticci, i neri, gli indiani, i servi a contratto, no, tutto questo insieme di ceti subalterni di cui egli ha ricostruito le varie traiettorie, i vari incontri, i vari incroci nell'ambito della loro capacità di produrre autonomamente politica, di produrre politica in modo autonomo, cioè non in relazione alle filosofie politiche, quelle che siamo abituati a pensare, aver modellato le grandi rivoluzioni, il giusnaturalismo, Locke, eccetera, ma piuttosto in base alla loro specifica esperienza sociale. Certo, qui c'entra molto anche l'influenza non soltanto della History from Below, ma anche dei British Marxist Historians, che sono punti di incontro, no, di questo tema. Però di fatto l'opera di Rediker si svolge lungo questo principale percorso. E qui a me viene in mente un secondo importante elemento da rilevare, e poi mi taccio, e poi mi taccio, è che io non so che cosa facesse. I don't know what, Marcus, you were doing in the 60s and in the 70s, if you were a freaked out hippie or a member of the SDS. I don't know what you were doing at the time, ma in my opinion è molto importante l'elemento controculturale, e cioè Marcus tratta questi segmenti sociali come se fossero schegge di controcultura lanciate nella storia. Cioè sono come, non è un caso che diciamo così, la costruzione di comunità di questi che questi operano, no? Cioè, il caso più famoso, quello di cui tutti parlano, secondo me anche un po' a sproposito, è quello di Libertalia, no? La Repubblica dei Pirati, ma piuttosto il fatto che queste siano come delle comuni, come delle controcomunità, delle controsocietà che si stagliano, no, sull'orizzonte del pensiero politico e delle pratiche sociali del Settecento. Quindi a me viene in mente appunto il riferimento, diciamo così, quasi obbligato all'esperienza della controcultura nella sua valorizzazione della costruzione sociale dal basso. Cioè, ripeto, schegge di controcultura lanciate sull'Atlantico nel corso del 6-700. No, questo mi sembra essere un po' uno degli elementi anche interessanti dell'opera di Marx. E anche qui c'è una prova. Cioè, c'è una prova, un libro che ho tentato di far tradurre, ma non ci sono riuscito. Questo, che Marcus riconoscerà sicuramente. Questo è un libro pubblicato nel 1993 che mi sembra essere, si chiama Gone to Kraton, Origins of North American Dropout Culture. Ora, senza tirare fuori Timothy Leary e il turn on, tune in, drop out, senza stare a tirarlo fuori, è evidente che le culture di cui parla Marcus e di cui ci ha raccontato l'intersezione sono dropping out cultures, sono culture che si tirano fuori, sono culture che vanno alla ricerca di una propria autonomia, che non è soltanto un'autonomia politica e culturale, ma è anche un'autonomia sul territorio. Cioè tutti questi, le avventure, i percorsi, no, le traiettorie che Marcus ci ha offerto nel corso della sua carriera spesso culminano nel tentativo di costruire delle controcomunità, delle controsocietà. Se non temessi di dire delle scemenze, se non temessi di essere troppo avventuroso, direi delle zone temporaneamente autonome. cioè, the temporary autonomous zone, do you remember Hacking Bay? Something like that, cioè qualcosa di questo genere, no? Quindi anche questa è un'esperienza che secondo me è importante. In questo libro, pubblicato nel 1993, che si intitola, che è una serie di saggi sul radicalismo americano, visto da questo punto di vista, cioè dal punto di vista del tentativo di creare comunità autonome sul territorio, staccate evidentemente dal mainstream, non soltanto dal mainstream socialmente borghese capitalista dell'America con la K, quella più nota, ma anche dal mainstream, diciamo così, dell'esperienza dell'America nel suo complesso. E qui cioè, ristampano uno dei saggi che Markus ha scritto con il suo sodale Peter Limbach, con cui ha molto lavorato, che è un po' più vecchio di lui e più vicino di lui, credo, agli storici marxisti inglesi, che è questo un saggio che si intitola The Many-Headed Hydra, che è The Many-Headed Hydra, che è il titolo del loro libro più famoso, scritto un libro bellissimo, peraltro pubblicato in italiano. Vi faccio vedere anche questo è pubblicato in italiano. E qui c'è, diciamo così, si vedono anche i problemi storici e storiografici dell'impostazione, dell'impresa storico-storiografica di Markus. E qui io vorrei fargli l'unica domanda che mi sembra, diciamo così, davvero rilevante all'interno di questo discorso. I want to ask you only just one question. All'interno del libro c'è un paragrafo che si chiama Vettori della rivoluzione, Vectors of Revolution in the Many-Headed Hydra. Do you remember the paragraph which is more or less at the end of the fifth chapter, when you ask what kind of vectors could okay, do you remember? Ecco, ora chiedo, dopo 20 anni, after 20 years, what do you think about the value, the historic value of that kind of vectors of revolution? Cioè, perché naturalmente cosa dobbiamo chiederci nel momento in cui affrontiamo un tipo di storiografia dal basso e controculturale come quella di Markus? Dobbiamo chiederci qual è stata l'efficacia di quelle esperienze, cioè le tante libertarie di cui lui ci ha parlato. Che cosa davvero hanno fino a che punto hanno impattato sulla sensibilità e la cultura delle rivoluzioni americane e delle rivoluzioni francesi? Dove sono what are the interlocking pieces between the various countercultures you have written about and the general ideological context of American and French revolution? But do you think the same? Do you feel that the hypothesis is valid? Don't answer. No, ho finito. Mi taccio, ho parlato 20 minuti, 25 minuti. Dunque, ora non so se vogliamo lasciare la parola a Eleonora Belligni o Markus, do you prefer to answer after Eleonora? Or, ok, allora non sono io che devo darti la parola, Eleonora, ma comunque prenditela.
Yes. Ok. Ringrazio in italiano la Fondazione che ci ha ospitato oggi e ringrazio insomma, Paolo Soddu che ha introdotto la nostra chiacchierata e ovviamente insomma, gli ospiti che ci stanno ascoltando. E questa è l'unica frase che dirò in italiano per i prossimi 10 minuti, diciamo. So, I am delighted to be here today, not only because I really like the book we are going to discuss, but especially because I have always liked the author, Markus Rediker. As Pietro said, in Italy, Rediker is renowned as the historian of the Atlantic and its social and economic interactions. But moreover, as Pietro pointed out, as a social historian of marginalized groups and what he defined motley crews of pirates, maroons, outlaw sailors of any kind, and even women, like the most famous Mary Read and Anne Bonny. Speaking of which, I will start with my very reason to be here. My friend, my dear friend, Pietro Adamo, called me a few weeks ago saying, "So I've got good news and bad news. Which one first?" I always tend to want good news first, so good news first. So you will meet on remote Markus Rediker. And that, of course, made me thrilled. And you will discuss one of his latest work, The Fearless Benjamin Lay. And I said, well, great. So what about bad news? And he said, bad news is that the organization of the seminar explicitly needed a woman. And that is the main reason why we actually thought about you, as you are not a specialist. Frankly speaking, he has a point. I'm a specialist neither of the Atlantic environment, slavery, abolitionism, pirates, or global traders, nor of the 17th, 18th centuries radical religious descent, from its birth during the English Revolution to the American developments of some of its branches, like Quakerism. So it was not really flattering at the moment. But I have to admit that these kind of solutions might be proved useful, especially in a context like Italian academia, which has just begun to approach the issue of gender equality and still sort of struggle to find a way to negotiate. So my point here is, being no more than an amateur historian of this period, I had to focus on the one thing in my career I could rely on for sure, that I am a woman. And therefore, a member of the larger minority in the world. Thus, I was compelled to start thinking about my personal way to read the biography and the legacy of Benjamin Lay, as told in Markus Rediker's book, which is exactly through the lens of a minority. Nevertheless, I had to take into account the lesson told by the revolutionary Atlantic and by Benjamin Lay's life, that there are several ways to be an outsider, and that one could be disowned and treated as an outsider even by her or his own marginalized group. Lay's experience demonstrated that you could always raise the outcast bar further. But where does this lead? Actually, when I read the book, my attention was caught by the idea of the relationship between being different and being an innovator, a groundbreaking. That is, in my opinion, a way to define Benjamin Lay, which seems to paraphrase the word fearless Benjamin Lay, much better than the Italian translation, piantagrane, which is troublemaker. Of course, Benjamin Lay was a troublemaker, as much as he was an innovator, and partly because he was an innovator. But first, I think we should need to recognize that he was different, actually one of the most different people of his time, one of the kind of radical and marginalized members of the Atlantic world that Markus Rediker has studied for the past 30 years. And then again, the Quaker Benjamin Lay was even more different from the rest of the group. For this reason, he caught Rediker's attention at the time he and Peter Landau were doing researches for the many-headed Hydra. Lay's marginality was partly due to his qualities, his body, and his, well, impetus, bad temper, I would say, partly to his passions, interests, and beliefs. He could be described by his disabled body, although he refused to see in his dwarfism a proper disability or an occasion to lack any of the self-confidence he needed to perform his fights and his acts of bravery. Then, he could be described easily by a long list of behaviors he firmly refused to follow, like indulging his Quaker fellow brothers' recent habits about supporting slavery and slave trade, exploiting the environment, eating animals, put human and positive laws above one's conscience. Or eventually, he could be described by his dramatic actions and his theatrical behavior, not only during his guerrilla theater acts that he performed once in a while as a form of protest, normally in front of Quakers meetings or inside Quakers meetings, but with his whole lifestyle spent in ascetic, autarkic, and environmentalist separation from the common way of life and consumption typical of his context, which, as you know, actually meant he spent the last 25 years of his life living in a cave, almost completely self-sufficient, growing his own food, making his own clothes. Beyond Philadelphia communities and his neighbors, this lifestyle cast a significant shadow on the comfortable, consumer-oriented lives of Quaker elites throughout the Atlantic world and on Quakers' activities in 18th century banking, commerce, and sea trading. Being different and acting differently were at the same time the main reason and the natural consequences of Lay's different way of thinking, which was, as Markus demonstrates, the result of multiple paths and inspirations, many environments of various traditions and legacies. It is true, though, that the first and most influential strand of Lay's radicalism, what really made him the first revolutionary abolitionist, was the tradition of early radical Quakers, the first wave of Quakerism dating from the English Revolution, along with renters, seekers, leveler, diggers, and other radical groups, and sometimes flowing in smaller river of antinomianism. Markus Rediker suggests that antinomianism was perhaps the magical ingredient, the ingredient which made the innovation performed by Benjamin Lay significant and somehow successful in his later days, very later days, and after his death, and which made him the forebearer of a, I quote, a new genealogy of anti-slavery, with early origins among the poor and the commoners, as he was, well before late 18th century Enlightenment thinkers and, I quote, middle and upper class abolitionist sense made the cause of anti-slavery very popular. Lay's strong testimony against slavery, the fierce accusations launched against his own community, his fellow brothers, Quakers, and especially the wealthier Friends, did not make him the voice of one calling in the desert. As Markus Rediker writes, in the same period, other men shared his beliefs, and he himself took inspiration from the work of Ralph Sandiford. But at the end, all the other anti-slavery pioneers did not find a way of voicing or acting their claims out, and none of them dared to challenge the community in such vehement ways. Fact is, Benjamin Lay was a versatile and creative approach to his own commoner's life, to his religious community and its hierarchy, and to big picture issues regarding a global economic process made, among the other things, by slave trade and shipping and selling the products of slave labor. All things that contributed to the considerable wealth Quakers accumulated in the 18th century transatlantic economy. This very approach led to a kind of multi-layered innovation that extensively contributed to the posthumous victory of Benjamin Lay and his cause. So here, borrowing some categories from sociology and policy analysis, I would like to consider three kinds of innovation to describe Lay's conduct and to try to define a link between his diversity, his strategies, and the success of his ideas. The first one, which could be defined content or intellectual product innovation, implies finding new ideas, namely new solutions to traditional problems or new perspectives to look at old issues. Undoubtedly, after their experience in Barbados, Benjamin and his wife Sarah found another perspective on slavery from a matter-of-fact economical institution procedure which was practiced by Quakers as a mean to reach wealth and a higher social position, to an open defiance to God's word, and later on a nearly demoniac practice, only bound to guarantee a lower position in hell. Here, the explicit innovation is shifting the slave trade from a mere economic process, the many middle passages, to a matter of conscience, morals, and religion. But at the same time, many aspects of his wealthy friends' lives, indeed very similar to non-Quakers' way of living, especially in Philadelphia, deserved to be treated as moral and religious issues, from eating animals to wear expensive clothes or living a life ruled by profit and consumption. Lay reconsidered and relocated the Calvinist concept of calling from the, I quote Weber, the evaluation of the fulfillment of duty in worldly affairs as the highest form which the moral activity of the individual could assume, to a more radical public space where the conscience rules, producing equality, justice, and freedom from slavery, even against man's laws and worldly affairs. The second kind, which is known as process innovation, implies finding alternative methods to face all the new problems. Frankly speaking, we cannot say that Benjamin Lay used new methods to face his favorite issues. In fact, it is quite the opposite. As he had been using his whole life the instruments he was provided by an old moral and meta-religious tradition, the antinomian one. From his point of view, considering the conscience as the primary tool to build a brand new value system meant, at the same time, going much farther forward and farther backward, a sort of reverse way from the wealthy friends' interpretation of the spirit of Calvinism to the origins of the Quakerism. The third kind is known normally as symbolic innovation, which normally means finding new ways to communicate an idea or to advertise public actions. This was probably Lay's strong suit and the very core of his revolutionary action, and it was much more than a rhetoric or a narrative. Benjamin was looking for the most democratic forms of expression, as Markus Rediker said. Living pulp theater, one-man flash mobs, prophecy telling, and his book, which was actually a commonplace book, he said, were all means to get a direct access to his audience conscience and to their emotions. Certainly, Lay's guerrilla theater and his 1738 book, All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage, Apostates, forced Quakers, especially slave-owning Quakers, to consider the morality of slavery. At the end, the combination of these three kinds of innovation succeeded quite quickly in changing Quakers' agenda about slave trade. More than everything, Benjamin Lay's fight led to a reshaping of their identity and to a miry consideration of some of their genealogy, decades before the worldly and economic success, when being peaceful and harmless and refusing human laws and methods were actually options in order to deserve God's grace. These sparkle of antinomianism, which regained some feeble voice after Lay's death, testify why it makes sense to read his history as, I quote, an intellectual history from below, intellectual from below, and why, as we realize that, I quote, the movement from below broke through to enable Quaker abolition from above. There is still hope for outcasts, marginal people, and fighters against slavery. And pro-justice, well, leave alone women. Okay, I'm done here.
Ok, a questo punto tocca a Markus. Markus, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Just trying to.
Yes.
Well, I'm not getting. Okay. Let me begin by thanking Pietro and Eleonora for these wonderful comments. I'm extremely grateful to you for organizing this event. I'm also very honored to be part of the program of the Einaudi Institute or Foundation. And it's just a pleasure to meet with people in Italy about Benjamin Lay. I guess the first thing I would say is that this is, as both Pietro and Eleonora have said, an example of history from below, in basso. And of course, Pietro understands very, very well the tradition from which I emerge. This is the British Marxist tradition. Christopher Hill and Edward Thompson were my teachers. Peter Linebaugh and I wrote The Many-Headed Hydra as a way to connect their work between the English Revolution, the 1640s, and the Age of Revolution in the 1790s. That was where we started. But we also ended up making a critique of the absence of slavery and imperialism within some of their work. But anyway, so that work has evolved over the years. As Eleonora said, I first found Benjamin Lay while Peter Linebaugh and I were working on The Many-Headed Hydra. And I should say that as I studied him, this was more than 20 years ago, I was so fascinated by what I was learning that I said to myself, this man deserves his own book. So he does not actually appear in The Many-Headed Hydra. And I had several other books to write, but finally, beginning around 2014, I decided to come back to Benjamin Lay and give him his own proper treatment. That work was really guided by two fundamental questions. The first question is, how did an ordinary working person, now, Benjamin Lay was not an elite in any sense. He was born on a small farm. He worked as a sailor. He had very little education. And yet, he made this breakthrough in human thought. And that breakthrough was to be one of the very first, and certainly one of the first Europeans, to say that slavery must be abolished immediately, unconditionally. We've got to abolish it now. Now, there had been some discussion about how slavery could be abolished gradually. Benjamin said, no, it's got to happen right now. Now, this is happening 2 generations before the proper anti-slavery movement will emerge, really in the 1780s and 1790s. So Benjamin is many years ahead of his time. So how did that happen? How was he able to do that? What kind of influences allowed him to say something that it was so hard for many other people to not only to say, but even to think? The overwhelming majority of people around the world, and especially those of European descent, considered slavery in Benjamin Lay's day to be as natural as the sun and the moon and the stars in the heaven. It was a completely natural phenomenon. Most people accepted it without question. And many accepted it because they would benefit from it materially. But Benjamin broke through that common sense of his day. So that was the first big question I wanted to answer. What allowed him to make that breakthrough? The second question that I wanted to pose in this book, and this is especially important for American history, if Benjamin Lay was as important as I maintain that he was, really a breakthrough kind of figure, if he's so important, why is he almost totally unknown? Because in American history, Benjamin Lay is really unknown? So those two questions, how did he break through and why is he unknown? And those were really the things I wanted to try to answer with this book. I'll just give, actually, Eleonora has already given the primary answer, but I'll just summarize briefly the answer to the first question, why he made the breakthrough. It was a combination of four things. You might say four different kinds of radicalism came together in his experience and in his mind. The first of these was radical Quakerism. In the English Revolution, the Quakers were born in revolution in the late 1640s and 1650s. And their early leader, James Naylor, was an extremely radical figure. He became kind of a model for Benjamin Lay in a very serious way. But George Fox, who is much better known as the father of Quakerism, was very opposed to the kind of radicalism that Naylor represented, and he instituted a bunch of reforms to try to get rid of the antinomian spirit, again, which Eleonora mentioned and emphasized quite rightly. This idea basically holds that people have a direct relationship to God and they don't need authorities of any kind to tell them how to think or act. It's a very radical idea, if you think about it. We don't need priests, we don't need kings, we don't need members of parliament, we don't need elected officials. We will make up our own minds. This is what antinomians believed. So this radical Quakerism is, I think of this as a rope. It's a rope with four strands coming together. The first strand is radical Quakerism and antinomianism. The second strand is seafaring. Benjamin Lay worked for about 12 years as a sailor. He sailed around the world. He worked among a motley crew, meaning a multi-ethnic, multiracial workforce, and he learned from these fellow sailors. What did he learn? He learned, first of all, to be cosmopolitan. Actually, a word that I think was invented by Diogenes, the ancient Greek philosopher. He said that I'm basically a cosmopolitan. I am a citizen of the cosmos, right, of the world. I'm not narrowly a national citizen. So Benjamin Lay, as a sailor, encounters this set of experiences, but he also learns the sailor's ethic of solidarity, because working on a ship in this period was extremely dangerous. And there was a very high degree of solidarity among the people who worked together because they risked their lives. Many work cultures that are dangerous have very high levels of solidarity. Mining, for example, is known for this. Seafaring is another. So these experiences at sea allowed Benjamin Lay to criticize the slave trade. He called it social murder, basically, that the merchants who were creating the conditions of the slave trade were basically murdering many of the Africans who went on board the slave ships, okay? And then he also took the idea of solidarity and carried it further than sailors, saying anyone who works in hard circumstances, especially enslaved people, they deserve our solidarity too. We must fight for them. We must fight against their exploitation. So his seafaring experience is the second source of the breakthrough and the second strand in the rope. The third is his experience in Barbados, again, which Eleonora emphasized. Here, Benjamin and Sarah Lay came face to face with slavery in what is probably the most powerful slave society in the world at that time. They went there in 1718, and the wealth being produced by sugar, which was based on an extremely violent sort of slavery, was making the sugar planters extremely rich. Benjamin was horrified, and he began to speak out against slavery. He began to feed the hungry enslaved people, some of whom were actually starving to death. So this then got him in trouble with the big slave owners who wanted to run him off the island. He did leave about 2 years later, but he didn't give up the issue of slavery. This became the central idea of his life, to oppose slavery in all its forms. So this is the third source of breakthrough. The fourth is what I call revolutionary commoning, meaning Benjamin Lay as a person of the commons, living in a cave, refusing private property, making his own clothes, growing his own food. And his idea here was basically that we cannot allow the market to tell us what is the right way to live. We must reject the market as the source of human values, because when you buy a commodity in the market, you don't know how the person who created it was treated. This is actually an idea that Marx had in his explication of the commodity in volume 1 of Capital, that the commodity hides the source of its own production and hides the exploitation of the worker who created it. Benjamin Lay had this idea 125 years before Marx. And he therefore rejected any sort of behavior, any sort of activity that might contribute to the exploitation of other people or of animals. He regarded animals as our fellow creatures, just like human beings, and we must not eat them. So he was a militant vegetarian. He was actually even a vegan 200 years before that word was invented. So the fourth kind of radicalism that Benjamin Lay engaged in, much of this actually came from his reading in ancient philosophy, the Cynic philosophers like Diogenes. You add that to the rope and you get Quaker radicalism, maritime radicalism, the resistance of enslaved people, and the radicalism of the commons. All those things come together and allowed him to make that breakthrough. Probably if you're missing any one of them, you might not arrive at the same conclusion that he did. So that's basically the argument of the book. The second question I can answer more quickly: why is Benjamin Lay unknown? It's because he was the wrong kind of radical. He was too radical. He was too militant. His methods of guerrilla theater were extreme. He was confrontational. He was from the wrong class. He wasn't one of these enlightened gentlemen that the historians like to write about, right? He was a poor, ordinary working person with very little education. He had the wrong kind of body, right? He had dwarfism. He was only about 4 feet tall, 3 meters tall. He was tiny. He had a hunchback. It's called kyphosis. It's the overcurvature of the thoracic vertebrae. So he was literally disabled, although he did not think of himself that way. So anyway, all of these things allowed historians to kind of put him aside and pretend that he wasn't really part of the story of abolition. And in fact, one of the leading historians of abolition, David Bryan Davis, called Benjamin Lay a demented little hunchback. I mean, you want to try to marginalize somebody with 3 words? There it is. He's crazy, he's tiny, he's disabled. Don't pay any attention to him. But in my view, he deserves all of the attention. Now, so that's one reason why we don't know him. I'm doing everything I can to return Benjamin Lay to public memory. There's this book. I've co-written a song. I've co-written a graphic novel. I've co-written a play. I'm working on a film project. All of these things to bring Benjamin Lay back because we need him now, right? We need his example of principled militant radicalism, the refusal saying no to all forms of oppression. He was also a feminist. He believed that men and women were equal in the eyes of God. So he was a kind of radical that most people thought was only possible in the 1970s. A class-conscious, race-conscious, gender-conscious, environmentally conscious vegetarian. And he was all this 300 years ago. So I think that it would help us to know this. Let me, in the last few minutes I have, talk a little bit about some of the issues that were raised in the commentary. I do want to return to Pietro's idea about vectors of revolution. This is one of the main ideas of the many-headed hydra, which is to say that even when revolutionary movements are defeated, the experience of the defeated frequently acts as a vector or a line of force to some new kind of resistance. And what we found was that that was definitely true in the Atlantic. Benjamin Lay is one of those vectors of revolution. He was in many ways the last radical of the English Revolution. Even though he was born 20 years after it ended, he embodied those ideas. He then, through his own experience, added to that radicalism the radicalism of opposition to slavery, and connected that to movements in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the radicalism of England in the 1790s. So he is literally a vector, a carrier of ideas and radical practices through time. And in some ways, he's kind of a missing link between two different revolutionary eras. Okay, so I think that this vector of revolution is very important. And just to link it briefly to the present, all of the activism around the world, around the George Floyd murder, as Angela Davis emphasizes, this wave of anti-racist activism is unthinkable without the previous experience of people who were involved in other movements earlier on, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement. All of these movements have helped to feed a new generation. And these things, there is here, as in Benjamin Lay's case, there is a kind of underground or below deck history of radicalism, which we don't often see, but it's there. So that's one point. I'd also like to really emphasize Eleonora's point about the relationship between difference and innovation. And I think she's actually hit upon an issue here that I wish I had said more about in my book. There is no doubt in my mind that Benjamin Lay's dwarfism and the way he was marginalized because of his body is directly related to his sympathy and solidarity for other marginalized people, especially those who were enslaved. He had a very big heart. And this really was an important part of his willingness to identify. And he identified with enslaved people completely. He suffered with them. He fought for them. And I do believe that his dwarfism is a really important part of that. Eleonora mentions the radicalism of content, and that's absolutely true. Antinomianism is a very big part of it. That his ability to use that to rethink the slave trade and slavery, a very big part of it. She mentioned the process of innovation. The means, and the means, she says, and she's right, are fairly traditional. He wrote a book. He did things that people would normally do. He talked to people. He tried to persuade people. And then she comes to symbolic innovation, and she's absolutely right. The theatrical nature of Benjamin Lay's radicalism is critical, because the truth is his book is very hard to read. It's an unusual book. And he apologizes for it, actually. He says, I know I'm not the normal writer. I'm just a poor common sailor. What do I know about writing books? But his ideas became known and debated and influential because he acted them out symbolically and theatrically. This is really, in other words, in every meeting, a Quaker meeting, a meeting in a public market, a meeting in the streets, wherever it may be, Benjamin Lay would draw a line. And he would say, on one side of the line are the people who are opposed to slavery. On the other side are the people who are in favor of slavery. There is no middle ground. You're either for it or you're against it. What's it going to be? So his genius, in part, was agitation. He was an agitator. He made people feel really uncomfortable. A lot of Quakers despised him. They threw him out of the meetings. They disowned him 4 times. They threw him out. He didn't care because he knew that the truth was on his side. So he kept agitating. He refused to back down. He was fearless. And this is part of why he was so very important, this kind of symbolic innovation. I also would emphasize that we are able to study Benjamin Lay's ideas because he did write them down. And he also made such an impact on other people that they too wrote down what he said and what he thought. So we have a kind of an unusual archive that's come down to us, which really allows us to understand the thinking of an ordinary working man who is actually engaged in revolutionary thought. I think that's the key. And let me just end, I too, like Eleonora, think that the story of Benjamin Lay is full of hope. Because he fought and he fought and he fought and he thought he wouldn't succeed. He was an abolitionist for 40 years, fighting his fellow Quakers who owned slaves. And then the year before he died, the Quaker meeting took the decision that Quakers could no longer be involved in the slave trade. And Benjamin was very happy because he knew that this was the beginning of the end. Now, it took 17 more years for Quakers to say, no Quaker can own another human being. That didn't happen until 1776. But Benjamin Lay's ideas prevailed. They won in the end. And his ideas in some ways are more important now than they were in his own day. Because as I've said, we need him. And just one last point I'd like to make. I'm very proud of the fact that all 4 Quaker meetings that disowned Benjamin Lay for his radicalism in the 18th century, 2 of them in Great Britain, 2 of them in the United States, all 4 of them have now taken him back. They have embraced his radical spirit. They have admitted that the earlier Quakers were wrong, that Benjamin Lay was right, and they have now brought him back. So that to me is a hopeful sign that change is definitely possible. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to you. Eleonora, dunque, possiamo fare 2 cose. Innanzitutto ringraziamo ovviamente Markus,
Yes.
anche perché con la sua passione, with your passion, you have showed us what really could be the activity of the historians. What is the real meaning? I hope the real possible meaning of doing history, looking at a world that is around us, and not simply as an academic exercise. And this is very important. I don't think that there are many historians think in the same way. So, possiamo provare a dare la parola a qualcun altro se volesse porre qualche domanda?
Sì, io l'unica cosa è che non so come funzioni, perché forse dobbiamo chiedere a Fabrizio della Fondazione, perché la maggior parte delle persone seguono in realtà solo online.
No, ma questi che ci sono,
non
cioè qui ci sono,
cioè se non so se
loro
siamo
non possono,
autorizzati.
Non possono, possono soltanto coloro che sono collegati, cioè a Dante, Zuliani, Vadori, Pascuzzi, Carnino.
Ecco, su YouTube, da YouTube nessuna domanda, ecco, questo volevo capire.
E questo non lo so.
No, ce l'hanno scritto, sì.
Però possono fare le domande anche da YouTube.
Infatti, pensavo anch'io, ma...
Sì.
Ok, benissimo.
Scritte.
Non ho capito, Paolo, possono o non possono?
Possono, sì, sono domande scritte.
Allora, da YouTube domande scritte, quindi apriamo, diciamo così.
Ma non ci sono, però non ce ne sono per ora.
Non ce ne sono. E allora, se invece tra i presenti c'è qualcuno che vuol porre una qualche domanda al professor Rediker, se vuole può farlo in italiano e noi la traduciamo al professor Rediker. Se c'è qualcuno di voi che vuole chiedere, cioè non è cosa tutti i giorni avere tra di noi il professor Rediker. Io approfitterei dell'occasione. C'è qualcuno di voi che vuole fare qualche domanda? Vediamo. In italiano, ripeto, lo si può fare in italiano.
We're basically shy.
It's okay. It's okay.
Cioè, potete farla in italiano, ve la traduciamo noi. Se non volete farla...
Otherwise, I will start with a question, actually. A very small one. I would like you to talk a little bit about the importance of Sarah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Eleonora. Sarah Lay is a very important figure to this story, but it turns out it was extremely hard to find evidence about her. Sarah, I'll just briefly talk about who she was. Sarah was a Quaker, like Benjamin. She was from a port town on the Thames River. He probably met her when he was working as a sailor. She was from Deptford, right on the Thames. She also had dwarfism, and she had a hunchback. And she was also very committed to the abolition of slavery. But her methods were different. Benjamin was extremely confrontational. Sarah was not. Sarah was, even though she espoused the same ideas, she was never disowned by the Quakers. In fact, she had a position of what I would describe as spiritual authority, in the sense that she was allowed to visit other Quaker meetings as a representative of the faith. But when she passed away, and she was actually older than Benjamin by a few years, and she died much younger. She died in 1735. He would live for another 24 years. The Quakers who wrote about her and her contributions to their community were extremely complimentary, and they did try to use her against Benjamin by saying to him, "Look how well she behaves. Why can't you be like that?" But on the other hand, I think Sarah knew that Benjamin's militant tactics were necessary. He had to do that to melt, as he put it, to melt the ice all around him. And she supported him in that. She fought for him in that. She's the one who arranged their leaving England to come to Philadelphia. And there was actually a group of radical women Quakers that Sarah was a part of who made that move possible, led by a woman named Susanna Morris, a very interesting figure. So the women's history side of this is, it's hard to find much evidence, but we know that it was extremely important.
And she was kind-hearted too, wasn't she? I mean, I can remember that the thing you wrote about Barbados and how she was shocked about,
Exactly.
the man leaning on, from the cage and starving to death. And
Well, I would just add that, I found one of Benjamin Lay's books in a small archive outside of Philadelphia. And I was very excited to read it. And when I finally got there to read it, I discovered that Benjamin had actually written marginal notes, which tell us how he was thinking about the book he was reading. And one of the things he wrote was just, "Friends, be tender-hearted." This was a very high compliment for Benjamin. And he wrote a great deal about Sarah, and he emphasized that she embodied that trait of tenderheartedness. And it was her reaction to slavery in Barbados, her tenderhearted reaction, which I think was a big part of the impact that experience had on Benjamin. She was so horrified, including by what Quaker slave owners were doing. She was just horrified by that. And so therefore, she was a major contributor to the abolitionism that they developed together.
I have another question, not so little as Eleonora's, much more personal, not about Benjamin Lay, but about you. And it was, I have already asked you almost an hour ago, what were you doing in the 60s and 70s? What were your relationships with SDS, with New Left, with counterculture? Right. You were into that kind of affairs. You were a young revolutionary. Tell us something about that.
Yeah, I am very much a creature of the movements of the 1960s and 1970s. This goes back actually to when I was a student in high school, where I really was able to learn about, through basketball, to learn about Black America through my teammates. And this was kind of a major part of my learning. When I went away to university in 1969, the war was going on in Vietnam. This had a very powerful impact on me and thousands and thousands of others. I ended up, though, dropping out of school and going to work in a factory. From 1971, for several years thereafter, I worked in a factory. And this is where I really began to think. This is the place where I really began to study, to try to understand class struggle. And so that was probably the most formative experience to me. I should mention I come from a working class family in which everybody worked in factories. My brother actually retired from the same factory that I worked in. I got laid off from that factory job. I got a different factory job, and then I was able to go back to school part-time. So this is a big part of my education, being in that factory and learning what actually went on at the point of production. I continued to think, to learn. I had a lot to learn. And I paid a lot of attention to the debates about Marxism that were happening in Italy in the 60s and 70s. This was a very significant thing. I thought that was an extremely creative moment. So basically, I did go on to graduate school in 1976 with a commitment already formed to the idea of studying history from below. I'll tell a story about Christopher Hill, who wrote, as Pietro said in the introduction, a number of great books, but the one that was the most meaningful to me was called The World Turned Upside Down, which is about the English Revolution and the radical ideas that formed Benjamin Lay. Well, while I was working in the factory, I stole a copy of that book from the local bookstore. You might remember Abby Hoffman talking about steal this book. Well, fast forward about 12 or 15 years, when I've finished my graduate work, I've gotten to know Christopher Hill, and I'm introducing him to give a talk at Georgetown University, where I taught at the time. And I began by telling the story of my stealing his book and what a huge impact it had on my development as a historian. Because when I read it, I thought, wow, to write a book like that. So Christopher looked at me as I told the story, and he says, where's my royalty? So I took out a $1 bill from my wallet and I pushed it across the table to him, and he picked it up, put it in his pocket, and just started giving his talk. So the man was extremely funny. But
he has another kind of fame, you know, as a serious, as almost a dark character, while he was very funny, he was prone to tell jokes a lot. He was another kind of person from his public image, let's say in this way.
So anyway, that's how I ended up wanting to study history. Was very much influenced by Hill, Thompson. Went to England to do research in '78, met Edward Thompson at that time, and just, wanted to join this movement of people around the Atlantic and around the world who wanted to write history from below. And that's what I've spent my career doing ever since.
Okay. So, other... Cosa dici, Eleonora?
Question.
Okay.
May I?
Please.
Okay, thanks. And forgive my COVID-19 haircut, which is still on the way. I wanted to thank you for your paper, and which was most interesting in your book. And you have spoken about the importance of the ship dimension, the Navy, for the humanitarian construction in Lay, how that it was important for solidarity. But on the other hand, if I may, you have written a book on the slave ship, which is actually absolutely the contrary. The slave ship, Equiano, and John Newton in particular, how it's a hell on sea. So would you, if you don't mind, I'm curious in this, how the two aspects touch or contradict. Many thanks.
No, I think that is an excellent question. When I wrote the book that you mentioned, Federico, The Slave Ship, A Human History, I did so with a strong curiosity about how the sailors were going to behave on the slave ships. Because a lot of the sailors on slave ships were themselves there not by choice. They had been press ganged, or they would be run into debt and thrown in jail, and the slave ship captain would come and pay off their debts and take them to sea. But what I discovered basically was that on board the slave ships, the slave ship captain was very effective in policing the line between the free workers and the enslaved workers. And so it was kind of a dual system of violence and terror. So when when a revolt by the enslaved broke out, the free sailors didn't join it. Even the free black sailors didn't join it. They felt they were on the side of the owner. So this is and to give you another example, the slave ship captains would pit the two sides against each other. For example, Equiano, whom you mentioned, who was a young boy who was aboard a slave ship around 1754, saw a white sailor whipped so severely that he died from his wounds. And this was an instance of using the discipline of a sailor to try to discipline the enslaved. Because Equiano said, if they'll do that to their own people, what will they do to us? Sometimes slave ship captains would actually ask the enslaved people to wield the whip. So this is a divide and conquer strategy. But what I found was that when they were off of those ships, off of those specific ships, working on other ships that were not in the slave trade, that kind of solidarity could come back. And you even saw it one of the most remarkable things I found was that the sailors, the mostly European sailors, would arrive in a New World port. Frequently they were sick from diseases picked up on the west coast of Africa. They would have malaria or yellow fever or something. They would go ashore and they would be nursed back to life by enslaved women who knew the herbs and the ingredients to use to treat those particular diseases. And when they died, in many instances, their bodies were buried in the African burial grounds. So this to me was an extraordinary kind of expression of humanity. And it's a little bit like prisoners taking care of their prison guards, because that's what sailors really worked as. So I think the slave ship is really unusual as a site for labor. And I do think that when you're in the port cities, when you're on the other ships, I think all of the historians have found that there was a much greater sense of equality on those other ships than practically anywhere else in society, because people knew each other and they worked together and depended on each other. But you're right, it's a very serious contradiction, and I was very curious to see how that worked.
Many thanks.
Altre domande? A questo punto siamo qui da un'ora e mezza, forse possiamo chiudere. Cosa dice Eleonora?
Yes, I think, I mean, our audience is so shy. I'm sure they really want to ask you questions. And I don't know, sometimes these Zoom meetings are not the ideal thing.
Markus, the entire talk,
communication.
I want to say to Markus that the entire talk will be translated and subtitled by Elèuthera. Perhaps I told already to you them. So in next days, more people will have the opportunity to listen to our talk.
Excellent. Please send me the link when you have it.
Okay. Va bene, we can close our meeting, I suppose.
Yeah. We really have to tell you that I know it's not fair treating a living person as a myth, but you are a myth to us. I'm so sorry for that. I mean, it's not fair. I can tell it's just, but we were so happy to have you here. You can't even imagine. It was really the greatest thing to us. It was really, wow.
Well, let me just thank you warmly and say that it has meant everything to me that I think all of my books are now translated into Italian. And I do feel a special affinity with a lot of the people that I have met in Italy. I've been there many times to speak, and I'm very eager to come back. So I'm very grateful for the kind words. And the truth is that books have secret lives of their own. You don't know where they end up. You don't know who reads them. You don't know what they mean to people. So a friend of mine said, writing a book is like dropping a feather into a canyon. You don't hear many echoes. So I thank you for your echo, Eleonora. Thank you very much.
Ok, non so, adesso ci vuole qualcuno della fondazione, perché si chiude.
Io possiamo chiudere.
Ci sei, Paolo?
Possiamo chiudere qui se non ci sono altri interventi. Ringraziare tutte e tutti. Aspettiamo la versione sottotitolata che tu annunciavi.
Certo, sì, mi è stato. Noi adesso tu mi darai questa, cioè ci sarà una registrazione.
Certo,
tu mi dai, io la passo alle persone che hanno detto che si occuperanno di questo, poi ve la ridaranno in modo tale che anche la vostra su YouTube potrà essere sottotitolata, cioè potrà essere tradotta.
Benissimo.
Magari girerà un po' di più.
Certo,
vale la pena, no? Ne vale la pena, nel senso che appunto che
i tentativi di comunicazione sono ben accetti.
Va bene, d'accordo.
Grazie davvero.